Welcome to our Read series. This series is designed to encourage you to R. Read the Bible, E. Every day, A. Ask questions, and D. Determine to obey. As pastor of Oregon Trail Baptist Church, it's my goal that this time of reflection on the Bible reading from the previous week will serve as an encouragement to you to read the Bible, but will also open up opportunities to share, discuss, and ask questions about what you've discovered in God's Word, that we may grow together. As we renew our minds by the washing of the Word, we desire to draw closer to God and to each other.
All right, so this Mark, today or tomorrow is the last couple chapters of Mark, so you might not have it all read yet. So any comments, questions, things you noticed in the book of Mark this week?
In Mark chapter 9,
Uh-huh.
verse 19, who was Christ talking to?
Let me pull that up. Mark 9:19. Oh, it's going to be slow on me. Okay. He answered and said, "O faithless generation, how long shall I be with you?" So you're referring to when he says, "O faithless generation"?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, I have formulated my thought. What do you think? Who do you think he's addressing?
I originally thought he was addressing his disciples,
Okay.
but then when he said later on, in 29, this can only be done through fasting and prayer, and I thought that was a very compassionate and helpful answer.
Mm-hmm.
So it just seemed unusual.
Okay. Yeah. So the question is in Mark 9:19, when Christ says, "O faithless and generation, how long shall I be with you?" Oh, that's hard to read, isn't it? Let me make it a little bigger. Who is he addressing? Okay. And I think disciples is not wrong, because it's the disciples who have come back and failed, with the casting out of the Spirit. They couldn't do it. But is it possible he's speaking about more than just the disciples? And what would be our hint to that? The word generation. Okay, now, this is where, the disciples, there's 12 of them, right? Roughly. Because remember, there's others that follow Jesus, but there's the official 12, right? Okay. What type of group or culture did they come out of? Oh, yeah, most of them were poor, but you have Matthew, who's a tax collector, who's quite wealthy. And I'm not sure with some of the ones with the fishing industry if they were doing really well. I guess these disciples are coming out of the current Judaism, what the Jews of the day thought. So with that, maybe what's happening here is, yes, it's the disciples here who are acting faithless, but in Christ speaking to his disciples and addressing their lack of faith, we have a whole generation here of the Jews in the first century who are also rejecting Christ. So you see how he's speaking to the disciples, but he's very much speaking broadly. And yet, does that not apply to us today? Do we not need to have faith to see God work in ways today that...
And we know it was their lack of faith.
Let's see here. I want to say yes, because in one of the other Gospels, we have it, you couldn't cast out because of your unbelief. But it's not, I don't see that's what it says here. I could do some more digging on that. Do you want me to dig a little more?
I just found it unusual.
Yeah, let me write that down.
I thought the second comment was so loving and understanding, and I thought this one was a little harsh, but perhaps not.
Yeah, and the other verse there was down in 29. Okay. I'll do some digging on that, see if I find some good stuff for next week. So, good question, though. Any other comments or questions? Okay, we are in the Gospel of Mark, and I want to go a little short today because I want to give some time for Jory. Let's see if I can get your last name right. I'm just going to lose it. Petitsi. My wife helped me. Is that right? Petiti. Okay. Is it Italian? It is. Okay. All right. I threw a few things here I just want to talk about a little bit on Mark. Mark is one of the Synoptic Gospels. Now, there's your $5 word for the day. What is a synoptic? That's not a word I suppose any of you used this week or last week. That is really good. Yep, one that parallels others. So sin, not sin, S-I-N, like something you do that's bad, but sin, S-Y-N, like synonym, is something that's similar. Okay? So when we talk about the Synoptic Gospels, there are 3 Gospels that have a very similar viewpoint as they approach writing their Gospel. Any guess of what those are? Sorry? That's 4. There's only 3 synoptics. Well, you got 2 right. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke. These are considered the Synoptic Gospels. They're very similar in their viewpoint and outlook. John is a very different gospel. Not that it's... Well, that was a bad way to say that. It's not that it's another gospel, but John spends a lot of his gospel focused on the last week of Christ. So there's just a very different focus and energy to it and how he writes. But it's like turning a diamond and seeing different facets of it. So, yeah.
Pretty much the items parallel in the same order almost.
Yes. And when we get to Luke, we'll talk about why I think Luke takes some different orderings. Because you scratch your head and sometimes wouldn't it be nice to just have them all put together into one? We think that, right? We almost naturally think that. And it's not a new thought because there was a book. What do they call it? I want to say Diatessaron, but that doesn't sound right. I know there are polyglots. Polyglots where they would take all of these and kind of mash them into one and put all the stories together and try to make it into one line. But each gospel's highlighting different aspects of Christ. And so they have the freedom to adjust and rearrange things as needed as they tell the story so they can give emphasis and highlight to certain things. In one sense, Matthew's going to highlight the Jewishness of Christ. And so it's very much written with the Jews in mind. Mark is going to highlight, in a sense, Christ the perfect servant and his laying down of his life and suffering and dying. In some ways, even though it's a very Jewish book, it's going to resonate very well with Romans, who they want a perfect servant. Luke, anybody take a stab at what Luke is going to emphasize? Yes, Christ the perfect man, and then John is going to emphasize Christ the Son of God. So I just wanted to bring that up. Now you know what the word synoptic means. When you read Mark, 90% of the stories in Mark are in another gospel. So like your more unique stories are found out in Matthew and Mark, the ones that aren't everywhere. So it's also the shortest of all of them. It's only 16 chapters. Any guess why I wrote the word Peter here? in one sense, Mark's gospel is really Peter's gospel. Not to be confused with the Gospel of Peter, which is no, not the right word. The Gospel of Peter it's not in our Bibles for good reason. It's a Gnostic text somebody wrote pretending to be Peter. It's a really weird one. It has a walking, talking cross and things like that. It's kind of like the Gospel of Thomas. When I say the Gospel of Mark is really, in a sense, Peter's gospel, what do I mean by that? No, not exactly.
There is debate as to who actually wrote the book.
Yes, there's a little debate of who wrote the book. You want to go into that?
Well, it could be Mark, but Mark, you don't know nearly as much about.
Right.
And Peter was firsthand on almost everything.
Right. So it seems like John Mark, was Peter's helper. So as he's traveling with Peter and working with Peter and growing with Peter, he's hearing these stories and he's compiling them. So whether Peter worked with him or not, we don't know. This is one of those exceptions because we look at New Testament books. Was it written by an apostle or someone who worked close to an apostle? Well, Mark is one of the ones, he wasn't necessarily an apostle, but he worked really close, we think, with Peter in producing this book. So it seems to be, if anything, this gospel would be very closely related to how Peter would have portrayed, the gospel or Christ. So that's why Peter has a strong connection here.
I thought Peter was significant too because he was the first one to say thou art the Christ.
Yes. Yeah.
God first.
And that's a key point to the whole gospel because it's like, who is this Messiah? What is he? And then how do we respond? And he is the first to say that at a very key location, Caesarea of Philippi. It's also a gospel of action. Chapter after chapter and section of section will start with the word euthus, which is the Greek word for immediately or right away. And it's just, as you read these stories, they're very short. They're not drawn out like Matthew or Luke will have them. They're very short. They're to the point. It just moves very quickly. I'm going to skip the structure. I'll come back to that. One of the interesting things is Mark 15:39. Let me pull that up for you. Ooh, I forgot the period. Okay, so Peter early on in the gospel says, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God," right? Once Christ dies, what happens to most of the disciples and really most of his followers? What happens to their hope? It dwindles. I wouldn't say it's stamped out because they do go to Galilee where they wait for Christ to come back and return, as he said, which most people think that's them abandoning the faith, but really they're going there because that's where he said he would meet them. But they're in kind of shock and awe at this moment, right? Who's the first person after the crucifixion to acknowledge Jesus as the Christ, as the Son of God? Andrew? A Roman centurion. I think that's part of the Mark winking at Roman culture here. Because here, in one sense, it's an outsider who has this statement here, truly this man was the Son of God. Now, in the context of Roman culture and Greek culture, they view their Caesars as gods, and they view, but he's realizing after all this takes place, the crucifixion, the sky goes dark, all this happens, here's the Roman soldier standing there going, we just crucified the Son of God. So I think that's kind of an interesting, important point. So, thoughts or questions here? All right, as far as structure goes, I decided to draw it out ahead of time. That way I wouldn't spend 20 minutes drawing it in the middle. So the first 8 chapters, that moved a word. That was funny. start in Galilee, which is up north, and it really deals with the question, who is Jesus? Okay, we have, who's the person who introduces Jesus? John the Baptist, all right? And this ties into Isaiah 40 and several Old Testament passages. And at that moment when we have the forerunner who will introduce God coming in his kingdom, who's put into that spot? It's Jesus. You know, he's the Son of God, the second person of the Trinity. And then there's questions about, is he really the Messiah or not? And so Mark is laying out all these things he's doing of healing the sick and forgiving sins. And how do people respond to this? Okay, there's a crowd who are thronging to him. Why?
They wanted to see what he was going to do next.
Okay, there's the element, there's those who want to see what he's going to do next. There are those who believe he is Messiah. I would say, you could probably say there's those who aren't sure, but they're looking, they're longing. But do we have any other responses to Jesus? Yes, disbelief or discrediting, right? So the religious leaders are like, no, he can't be, the Messiah. So we have these different responses to who Jesus is. And that leads in some ways to the next section. So on their way from Galilee to Jerusalem, second half of chapter 8 to chapter 10 really goes, what does it mean for Jesus to be Messiah? Because did the Jews think the Messiah would suffer and die? No, that wasn't necessarily really on their radar. They wanted a conquering king. What's really fascinating in Second Temple literature is they struggled with certain Old Testament passages. There's certain Old Testament passages that they would look at, and in Second Temple literature, they started to say there might be two Messiahs. Because they saw a suffering Messiah and they saw a reigning, conquering king Messiah. But in the general response of the Jews of the day, which Messiah did they really want to see? The conquering king. Why were they so interested in the conquering king? They wanted Rome to be overthrown. They wanted to be established back, in the seat of power. They wanted to do their things their way. So isn't it interesting how they can have things in their scriptures that they almost sweep under the rug because there's a certain thing they want? This is a danger for us as we approach the Bible. We can sweep under the things that are uncomfortable for us or the things that don't fit our agenda and go specifically for the verses or things that fit what we want. And really Christ is challenging the disciples, the religious establishment. What do they anticipate as a Messiah? They weren't really picturing a suffering servant coming, one who would suffer and die on behalf of his people. And then the last chapters 11 to 16, really is how Jesus becomes king. And I don't even like that phrasing, because it's like, in one sense, he is king before he's, before he dies on the cross, he's king. But in one sense, this is like the coronation ceremony moving forward. And how do I say this? Maybe his kingdom is, or his kingship is recognized and seen that he is the king. And thus we have the centurion saying, truly, this was the Son of God. So, thoughts, questions there? Comments, concerns?
What they were looking for was like another Egypt,
Yes, yeah, they were looking for...
where they would be sanctified and brought forth and become a great nation. But they blew that.
Yeah, they wanted another deliverance like Egypt from the Romans. And they were looking and longing for that. But at the same time, their hearts were corrupt. I mean, here you have the religious leaders who do the right thing, and what are they conspiring behind closed doors to do? We need to knock this guy off. And in the Gospel of John, we clearly read, it's not just Jesus they wanted to knock off. Who else did they try to knock off? Lazarus. Remember the guy Jesus raised from the dead? So here you have the religious establishment who looks good, but behind closed doors, they're conspiring to knock people off. So, yes, they're looking and longing for a deliverance like Eve. Yeah, exactly. So, yeah. Yeah. And if you look at John the Baptist, he really fits a lot of the imagery of Elisha or Elijah and those prophets. Yeah. So.